Hey everybody, I'm going to do a screencast of this PowerPoint for this week. This is our lecture this week. Let me just turn the volume up a little bit because I'm not sure you can hear the volume, but hopefully you can. So this week we're going to be talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, and I really wrestled with, there's so many topics we could talk about with diversity or English language learners, and that may be a whole topic on its own. But I really wanted to just dig a little deeper into culturally relevant pedagogy because that's something that's good for all kids, and it's also something that cuts across grade levels, cuts across socioeconomic. No matter where you are, you really need to be thinking about this, and I want you to have a good understanding of this. So what is culturally relevant teaching? Culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching, or relevant teaching, that's why I said relevant by accident there, and learning is grounded in educational research which recognizes that young children, and I would go farther than that and say all children and all people, learn best in an interactive, relational mode. So that interactive and forming the relations and relationships is what contributes to learning. And culturally responsive teaching is based in that premise. Positive learning outcomes that you cultivate in your classroom are exponentially greater when children feel respect and appreciation that you have for the rich cultural capital that their family contributes to the educational environment. It's really, really important, however, to recognize or to emphasize that respect and appreciation. Because many of you who are going on to be teachers will be teaching in environments that are very culturally different from your own, and really understanding the importance of how respect and appreciation and for others' cultures is really important in your teaching. What is not culturally responsive teaching? And I think that's an important thought too is, and this came from a website that I found. It said one of the biggest misconceptions about culturally responsive teaching is thinking you have to tie the lesson's content to African American or Latino or any type of racial background. Say, well, I'm not talking about race, so it's not culturally relevant or not culturally responsive. And that is a myth. That is not true. The common belief is for two reasons. Number one, you have students who have so many different cultures, not just African American or Latino. And also, there's kind of a common belief. If you mention Africa or Mexico, or if you mention famous Black and brown achievers, then culturally responsiveness, you can check it off your list. And it's so much more and so much deeper than that. So it's not a box that you can check off. It's a way of being as a teacher that's more than just like Black History Month. It's more than, people think, well, if I talk about their culture, then they're going to be motivated. But in reality, culturally responsive teaching is less about using racial pride as a motivator and more about paying attention to students' learning styles and paying attention to students' cultural differences and thinking about how you can be inclusive and relational. And that is how learning happens. So the next couple slides are just kind of like some how-tos. There are actually when we think about a culturally responsive classroom, we want to think about a partnership between the teacher, the family, and the child. Now, these don't necessarily have to be equal relationships, but you have to think about how each one of these fits together. So the role of the classroom teacher is that you have to make knowledge accessible in a variety of ways. You have to welcome participation from families. You have to provide opportunities for families to come in, for students to be engaged. You have to really think about curriculum that plays upon some of the cultural differences and awareness of your students. The families, you need to bring them in as a teacher. That's your job. It's not their job to come to you. It's your job to kind of say, hey, we're a partnership. And we're going to talk a lot about this next week when we talk about family relationships. But teachers need to say, we need to be partners. We need to think, here are some things that I do at home, and here are something, or at school, and here are some ways that you can help me at home. And the role of the child is that the child is a value contributor to his or her learning process. Children need to help us learn about their culture. Tell me about the holidays you celebrate. Tell me about the way things work in your house. Tell me about your family. And I put this little picture in here about the Gonzalez family, and who are the important people in your children's families. Kind of doing this collage is a great way to start kind of tapping and bringing those three parts, the teacher, the family, and the child, together. Creating a culturally relevant and responsive learning environment. Some things that teachers can do to support this is work in partnership with the families to demonstrate high expectations. Setting clear and high expectations is so important for every learning environment. Demonstrate to children that you perceive them to be exuberant, capable communicators who learn through scaffolding and guidance and nurturing. You want to set those high expectations for them and communicate that they are capable learners. And together we're going to, I'm going to help you and you're going to help me learn about you. Integrate cultural capital of children carefully and thoughtfully. So really thinking about who our children are and having that high in your mind, and valuing and the home languages and home experiences, especially if you have children who are non-native speakers. What can you learn from them? How can you bring in some of their language and their words and their culture into your classroom? Ensure that curriculum content is engaging and relevant to your students' lives. So one of my favorite stories is I was working in an ELL classroom in Biddeford, and it was St. Patrick's Day. I guess it's 2 years ago now. And the kids all came in, and this was an ELL classroom, so non-native speakers and non-native Americans. And they said, why is everybody in green? Well, we don't understand what the St. Patrick's Day is. And it's funny because the teacher had on green and had a little shamrock, and it hadn't really even dawned on her that while everyone in the school was talking about St. Patrick's Day, that these kids didn't have that cultural understanding. And similarly, for example, when it's Ramadan or maybe a holiday that other kids in the class don't celebrate, it's important to educate going both ways and celebrating and explaining and making sure that we're connecting to their lives. Integrating art and music and movement and photographs in children's work. We talked a lot about that last week with Print-Rich Environment. Create a classroom community that's welcoming to all children and all families. Next week, again, we'll talk more about family relationships, but that's so important. And build your classroom to reflect the beauty, strength, and full capacities of all children. And learning centers are a wonderful way of doing this. Finally, my last slide in this is building on family assets in the classroom. So here are just a couple of slides with some suggestions, like a sharing time or sharing basket where kids can bring items from home to share so that they can share parts of their home lives with the family. Having that kind of morning meeting share time is a really important way to make these connections, and also harnesses that oral language expressiveness and social communication. Family of the week. I love this idea. Invite any or all family members to come and share a family album or a favorite book with the class. This activity highlights the customs and traditions of the family that extends these conversations. I remember, actually, let me finish this. It says families who feel welcome and comfortable are more likely to come. So if you invite them from day one and say, this is your week, then maybe day 20, when they have a problem, they'll feel more comfortable coming to you. I remember doing this when I was a student, and we all had to bring us food. Food is kind of a universal thing that everyone has, but people have different food. And I remember I was supposed to bring food for my family. and I could not have been raised in a more boring American family, but my great-grandfather was the controller of Campbell's Soup. So I remember being very proud to bring Campbell's Soup in to my classroom, because that was something that was important in my family, because I had a personal connection. So even Campbell's Soup is a family cultural tradition. Family treasure box I thought was really cool. A shoebox filled with examples of favorite things, family artifacts, family celebrations. I know my son did something like this when he, I think, was in kindergarten or first grade. He kind of had a shoebox full of important things to his family, and when it was his week, he got to talk about those. Star of the day, star of the week. I think a lot of you in your classrooms had kids who were stars of the week. But also to pull that into children can talk about themselves, but also talk about their families, talk about their customs, talk about who lives with them and what are some of the cultural things that they do. Again, wonderful oral language. So I'm going to shift from some activities now to some books, because we're talking about literacy in this class, and I want us to think more than a little about the books that the foundation of literacy is built upon. And those of you who've taken my 382 class, or 381 class, I'm sorry, we did something with this last semester. This is a really fascinating kind of bar graph, sort of. I just want you to look. This is from 2012, and luckily I think it's improved greatly since then, or at least has improved since then. But in 2012, looking at children's book, only 3% of children's books published were about African Americans, 1.5% about Latinos, less than 1% about Native Americans, 2% about Asian and Pacific Americans, and 93% of children's books that were published were children who were white or Caucasian. We need to be mindful of the types of books that we bring into our classroom and share with our students if we want to be culturally responsive teachers. So read alouds, very important part of foundation of literacy. A lot of you saw lots of read alouds happening in your classrooms, and I want you to think carefully about read alouds when we think about culturally relevant pedagogy. So thinking about read alouds and choosing particularly to honor students' experiences. Expect that your students will arrive with diverse home literacy experiences. Many will be familiar with read alouds from preschool, and I take a little issue with the second part of this quote here, or this, I didn't write this, this came from a website, but it says, higher student socioeconomic status, the more likely that students are being read to. And while that is uniformly true, don't go assuming that if your children are from a higher economic status school or family, that they will all have been read to. A good friend of mine, when my oldest was young, and she was a university professor, she was a history professor, her husband was a scientist, chemistry professor. They never read to their children. They were so kind of caught up in their own work. So that, so don't just say, oh, only the low socioeconomic don't read, because that is not necessarily true. But think about children's experiences. This is a wonderful book. Cora Cook's, I think it's Pancit, which is a Filipino book. So think about who's in your class and what kind of books can you use as read aloud that would honor their experiences. Choose books that reflect students' experiences. And I want to just draw your attention to that orange where it says books are mirrors for some, will be windows for others. Rudine Smith Bishop wrote a lot about literature as books, or literature as windows and literature as mirrors. And we really need to think about mirroring our students' lives so they see themselves in books, but also provide windows into other people's lives. So we don't want to just always be seeing ourselves. We want to be learning about others as well. So you need to think about that balance between both of those. And here is a book, I can't even say it.